Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our 12th meeting. We've got a good track record in looking at healthcare, and I think tonight is a different opportunity to look at the system and take a fairly world view of it, with a particular emphasis on India through our invitation to Rory Horner, and I'm delighted he's been able to join us because he will give us that more focused view of an industry that sort of has been crucial for quite some time, is changing all the time, and we may understand that it has certain we all think more strategically about it. Is it a crucial industry for the United Kingdom from several points of view? I think I'm stating obvious here, but he is Dr. Rory Horner, but in Q&A, if you have any particular ailments, he is not a general practitioner. He's a different kind of doctor, so we won't be able to help you. But there might be a member in the audience who would have some thoughts to share with you. But without further ado, could I please welcome Dr. Rory Horner.
Thank you, Bill, for the introduction, and Bill and Sam for the invitation, all of the organization. We're very much living in a fractured world, or perhaps better represented as a fracturing world, as this is an ongoing process. The war of Russia and Ukraine, what is frequently now talked about as the new Cold War or second Cold War between the United States and China. More broadly, a rise of nationalism, a growth of protectionism in the global economy, all of which bring globalization, or the global political economy of the last few decades, into question. Globalization emerged in the later decades of the 20th century, a product of improvements in transportation technologies, improvements in information and communication technologies, and a product of liberalization and what is usually referred to as freer trade between countries around the world. This led to the rise of global supply chains, whereby companies organize their production of goods, source commodities, and in more recent years, even the production of services in a global manner in order to take advantage of lower cost locations, but also specialized capabilities that are present in particular parts of the world. The pharmaceutical industry, as I will talk about now, is very much experienced that globalization, but it's one where that globalization has very much come into question and been subject to considerable criticism in recent years, most prominently during the COVID-19 pandemic. I'm going to approach the pharmaceutical industry and the question of its future from a perspective as an economic geographer, focusing on the industrial organization, the globalization of the industry, as somebody who has spent quite a lot of time over the last decade and a half talking to people running pharmaceutical companies in India, as well as in many companies in sub-Saharan Africa, about the challenges, and talking to them about the challenges they face in developing the industry and in leveraging its benefits for public health, as well as, of course, contributing to economic development. At a couple of points of the talk, I may have a little bit of a dry cough, which I've picked up, which is to bring a slight atmosphere of ill health to the talk, but I hope that atmosphere won't take over the talk too much. So what I really want to ask as a question is it the end of globalization in the pharmaceutical industry? Are we shifting towards and back to, in a way, a world where pharmaceuticals is organized within a national context, whereby countries promote local production and whereby our medicines are produced within the national border? And I'm going to think about this not so much, a little bit from the UK, but especially from a kind of global perspective, as Bill said. So first, let's consider the nature of globalization that we currently have within the pharmaceutical industry. The biggest and most well-known companies in the pharmaceutical industry are all headquartered in Europe or the United States. The biggest 5 pharmaceutical companies in the world, Pfizer, GSK, Merck, Roche, and Novartis. The biggest 4 vaccine manufacturers in the world, Pfizer, GSK, Merck, and Sanofi, all European or American-based. However, these companies rely quite considerable degrees on production of generic drugs in other parts of the world, as I will now talk about, and more broadly, there has been a huge shift in the pharmaceutical industry that these companies don't just produce within the region of the world where they're headquartered, but very much run and coordinate global supply chains. And these companies still dominate research and development and the development of new drugs, but in many ways, India and China play very vital roles for the world as a whole in its supply of pharmaceuticals. I have a very basic and brief depiction of a pharmaceutical supply chain here, starting with raw materials production, then the key stage of producing APIs, or what are active pharmaceutical ingredients. This is the key substance in the body which produces an effect when you take a medicine when you are ill, for example. API production is, for chemistry-based drugs, it's chemical intensive and involves various chemical reactions. So it's a chemical process and is part of the broader, in a sense, chemical industries. Formulations production is a physical process of combining those APIs with various excipients, which, for example, help to stabilize the drugs, and turn that into a liquid, a tablet, or a capsule, the common formats in which we consume medicines. After that, of course, there's a whole series of logistics, business, distribution, and marketing stages to bring the drug from the factory where it is formulated to the consumer or the patient, as we might refer to them within the pharmaceutical industry. It's estimated that China produces about 40% of all of the active pharmaceutical ingredients in medicines worldwide. About 20% of generic drugs worldwide are formulated in India, which I'll talk a little bit more about now. But essentially, India and China, especially at the early stages of pharmaceutical production, play key roles. Some of these drugs are still come under branding, even as branded generic drugs, with labels of companies that are more familiar to many of us in Europe, in the UK, or in the West more broadly. But those drugs can be produced through contract manufacturing agreements with companies in India especially, but also China, where there are huge economies of scale present and very deep and strong capabilities in the manufacturing side of the pharmaceutical industry. India's pharmaceutical industry is one which I've spent over a decade researching to understand how India developed what is largely seen as one of the biggest generic drug industries in the world. To give you a slight flavor of the size of this industry, there's estimated to be about 10,000 pharmaceutical units in India. And I've visited perhaps 100 of those in different parts of India. You might think, when you think of what a pharmaceutical company looks like, of perhaps a large corporate campus like AstraZeneca, which is located not so far from here, and which has, of course, AstraZeneca has many other facilities elsewhere in this country and around the world too. But there's a huge variation in the size of Indian pharmaceutical companies. So on the left is the office in Hyderabad of Aurobindo, one of the larger Indian pharmaceutical companies, but on the right is a picture of a very, very small scale unit on an industrial estate in Delhi where some essentially basic packaging activity of drugs takes place before it is supplied to the market. So there is huge heterogeneity within India's pharmaceutical industry. This industry was developed, and the most widely attributed factor to how India has such a prominent pharmaceutical industry is that from the 1970s onwards, India had very little patent protection on drugs. This meant that a drug could be introduced in the West to the world for the first time, and within a few months, a reverse-engineered or imitated version of that drug would be manufactured and made available on the Indian market at a fraction of the cost at which that drug was available elsewhere in the world. This was perfectly legal at the time for Indian companies to do because India removed product patents in the early 1970s. Many other countries, though, did not have patent protection in place in the 1970s, and actually, if we go back earlier, many European countries for quite a long period of time didn't have patent protection in place when they were developing their pharmaceutical industries. But India, in contrast to other countries in what we call the Global South, which tried to develop pharmaceutical industries in the mid to later 20th century, also put in place a lot of restrictions on foreign investments and requirements for multinationals. If they wanted to supply the Indian market, they needed to manufacture within the country, or else they had to leave the Indian market altogether. Anyway, India has developed this industry to such an extent where, in terms of vaccines, it's estimated that 2/3 of the world's children have been vaccinated with a vaccine produced by the Serum Institute of India, the largest vaccine manufacturer in India and the world in volume terms. In the context of the UK, it's estimated that about 25% of the drugs that the NHS buys come from India. In terms of the global impact of India's pharmaceutical industry, I'm sharing with you this chart, which I think is one of the most fascinating, maybe also disturbing and shocking charts in terms of late 20th century history, perhaps. At least I struggle to think of another one. South Africa, after the terrible years of the apartheid regime and the oppression that it involved, ended up having a fall of life expectancy by over a decade in the 10 years after apartheid ended. So just when life should have been getting better for many people in South Africa, many people's lives are cut short. The cause of this, of course, the HIV/AIDS pandemic, which had a disproportionate impact in South Africa and more broadly, Southern Africa. And what was particularly troubling about this fall in life expectancy in South Africa was that it occurred at a time when HIV/AIDS was no longer a killer disease for people living in the global north, in higher income countries where antiretrovirals were now available. But these drugs were too expensive for people in Southern Africa and more broadly in low and middle income countries. What turns around South Africa's life expectancy is, for the most part, the availability and provision of antiretroviral drugs for people living with HIV/AIDS, which transformed this illness from a killer disease into a kind of chronic disease which can be managed on an ongoing basis. Where did these medicines come from? These medicines came from India. India revolutionized the availability and supply of antiretroviral drugs. From 2001 onwards, Cipla, an Indian company, announced that these drugs could be supplied for $300 a year when the prevailing price had previously been $10,000 a year. It's now less than $100 a year. The South African government is one of the biggest buyers of antiretroviral drugs for people living with HIV/AIDS. India was key to that supply. So there are some key benefits which have come from the globalization of the pharmaceutical industry, and a globalization which is not just north-south or involving multinationals from Europe or North America entering into developing countries, but one which also has key south-south dynamics or interactions and trade and interdependence between developing countries, as this example of India and South Africa here involves. It's not just South Africa which Indian drugs are supplied to, but India is the key source of medicines for the Global Fund for HIV/AIDS, TB, and malaria, and for the United States PEPFAR, President's Emergency Fund for AIDS Relief Initiative. I'm not saying that without India that there wouldn't have been progress on antiretrovirals, but India did help pioneer and has become the key supplier at an affordable cost of these medicines. So that's a very brief segment on the globalization of the pharmaceutical industry and the key roles of China, and particularly India. Think back to 4 years ago, and just under 4 years ago, we start to see a wide range of border closures within Europe and, of course, beyond, as the COVID-19 pandemic starts to have its impact, and as the realization that this is not something that's just a problem for China, but is really a problem and a threat to people across the whole world. Restrictions on exports are put in place for personal protective equipment, for face masks, for gowns, etc., in many European countries from late February onwards. And there starts to be a fear emerges, which we saw in the media at that time, that pharmaceuticals and many medical goods are part of global supply chains. Much of the production takes place in faraway places that, and will there still be access to these goods and essential items for dealing with the pandemic if export restrictions are put in place? So a real fear, what happens if China no longer supplies personal protective equipment, if medicines don't come through with these border closures as they're put in place. This was not something that was, this fear was not necessarily new to informed policymakers or people within many governments in Europe or in the United States, but it was, that fear became echoed and much more widely held, and one the media really picked up on in those early months of the pandemic. And there was key ways we see that certain potential treatments at the time for COVID-19, where India especially had a key role to play in, but also there was huge fears that these would not be accessible and made available from India. So hydroxychloroquine, which Donald Trump brought a lot of attention to as a potential treatment, India produces, it's estimated that India produces about a huge majority of the world's supply of this anti-malarial. A company called IPCA produces about 80% of that drug within India. India put in place an export ban on that drug in early April 2020, and immediately Donald Trump threatened India with retaliation, saying the world needs, and America in particular, needs access to this drug which you're putting in place. Within a couple of days, India relented on its restriction on exports, but there was also fears that other potential treatments at the time, or which got attention as having potential to kind of reduce the symptoms of COVID-19, dexamethasone. It is also quite heavily, 46% of the global supply is produced from India. A company called Zydus Cadila is a major supplier in India of that drug. Remdesivir was a drug which attracted a lot of attention and strangely had zero production at the beginning of 2020 anywhere in the world because there wasn't much active use for it. But once it became seen as a potential treatment, Gilead had a patent for it, but Gilead didn't have the manufacturing capacity to meet the demand for it, so it signed a load of contract manufacturing agreements, especially with companies in India. So there was clearly India was playing a key role in production of potential treatments. There was a huge fear which became realized to some extent when India did put in place export restrictions on these drugs, even if some of these export restrictions weren't very long lasting. We saw a huge presence of nationalism and what border or what country you live in mattering a lot in availability of COVID-19 vaccines. High-income countries, before vaccines were approved, bought advanced or made advanced purchasing agreements with major manufacturers to get priority access to these vaccines and invested in multiple potential vaccines with the risk, of course, that some of them may not materialize into being effective. The World Health Organization considerably criticized this trend and argued for much more cooperation. It supported COVAX, which was the Global Vaccine Sharing Initiative, backed also by UNICEF, by Gavi, and CEPI, the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness and Innovation. COVAX was in a sense the hope for global cooperation. COVAX did, and in a sense I have a half full, half empty glass here, COVAX did manage to provide COVID-19 vaccines to people in low and middle income countries, the first batch being dispensed in late February 2021. So within 2 months of the first vaccine for COVID-19 being administered anywhere in the world as part of a wider protocol, which was late December 2020, some of these vaccines were available in low and middle income countries. So the CEO of the Vaccine Alliance at the time, Seth Barkley, in a way his defense or saying this is what COVAX had achieved was positive, was saying, well, look, normally it's many years that when a vaccine or a drug is introduced that it gets available in low and middle income countries. They managed to do it in the course of with only a delay of a few weeks. However, the glass half empty side is that COVAX had aimed to distribute 2 billion doses by the end of 2021 to people living in low and middle income countries. 1 billion of those doses were scheduled to come from the Serum Institute of India, the aforementioned largest vaccine manufacturer in the world. And about 65 million doses were exported from India from late February till early May 2021, and particularly in the February-March period. What happens then? India gets hit with a particularly severe wave of the pandemic. The Indian government essentially restricted exports of these vaccines and asked Serum Institute of India to redirect its supply to the Indian domestic need in the context of the huge emergency which was happening in India at this time. It took until October 2021 before COVID-19 vaccine exports from India resumed. The consequence was that COVID-19 vaccine delivery fell short via the COVAX mechanism for middle but especially low-income countries. COVAX eventually closed in December 2023, and only 3 years in, it took it almost 3 years to almost reach that 2 billion target of supply of vaccines. The consequence was that there was huge inequality in availability of COVID-19 vaccines, which was very much related to what income category of country you live in. The chart here is showing across the bottom is over time from late December 2020 until where we're at now in January 2024. The two lines at the very top are for high-income countries and then upper middle-income countries. The green line in the middle is for lower middle-income countries, and the line at the bottom is for low-income countries. And what we see is that both high-income and upper middle-income countries had relatively similar vaccination rates through the pandemic. The pattern for upper middle-income countries is heavily driven by China, which is the most populous country within that category. And although it's sometimes talked about as developed countries or global north countries had vaccines and countries in the global south or developing countries didn't, it's a more fine-grained pattern where the richer developing countries, upper middle income, actually had vaccination rates proceeded at similar rates to that in high income countries, driven by China itself, but also middle income countries, for example, Brazil, Argentina, Mexico, having domestic manufacturing capacity and forming technology transfer arrangements with AstraZeneca, but also with some major Chinese companies. The lower middle income category is heavily driven by India, but it's low income countries which especially were left behind. And 23 of the 26 low income countries in the world are in Africa, and the rest, and the majority of the other African countries are in with the low middle income category. So when we're talking about what part of the world was left behind, it is primarily Africa in terms of COVID-19 vaccination, which is I'm going to come back to how that relates to our question of the end of globalization. So The Economist puts in May 2020 the end of globalization, but it also had a subtitle, The Dangerous Lure of Self-Sufficiency. So my question here then is, does what's happened here with the COVID-19 pandemic, the way nationalism spread, the way clearly countries looked after their own populations in terms of who got access to vaccines and to drugs, does that mean that we're now shifting to a world of more local production? And in a way, there's three possibilities here for me. One is end of globalization and a shift to local production. The other is actually that there's not much change at all, that politicians, policymakers, when they're talking to the media at the time there's a major crisis, say that this is, we can't continue with this, that globalization has failed us, and that we need to have more domestic control over our pharmaceutical supply. But actually nothing happens and they don't do anything to change that. Or there's somewhat of a more middle ground where actually concrete steps are taken to start to adjust the situation, but in a landscape still where a lot of globalization continues to exist. And it's that third option which I'm going to suggest is what we're starting to see as sort of characterizing the post-pandemic pharmaceutical industry. So there have been a lot of prominent steps and statements made about the need for greater local production. One of Donald Trump's key advisors, a guy called Peter Navarro, was quoted in the media in April 2020. One of the things this crisis has taught us is that we are dangerously over-dependent on a global supply chain. Never again should we rely on the rest of the world for our essential medicines and countermeasures. And he was pictured then a few months later at the press announcement of huge US government support to Kodak Pharmaceuticals for a manufacturing of active pharmaceutical ingredients, APIs, in Rochester, New York. Kodak, which had very little prior experience in the pharmaceutical industry, but did have a lot of experience of chemicals from its sort of broader production process. This was an image which was circulated as part of the press release, justifying that so much is coming from India and China at the moment, the US has too much reliance on it, the need for greater American control. What ended up happening with this announcement was a few days later, there was an insider trading scandal which emerged, whereby the share price, of course, of Kodak Pharmaceuticals rocketed as this announcement was made, and the CEO had anyway made significant increases in his own share holding in just before the announcement was made. So there was a scandal around insider trading, and very little has actually materialized with this investment. There is another big $300-something million investment in a company called Flowcorp that the US government also stated they'd make in May 2020. It seems to have taken on a little bit more traction. In the European Union made similar statements. The EU's health commissioner said it's abundantly clear we need to work towards the need for increasing the productions of medicine and innovation within the EU. And various statements were also made in the UK media about needing to become less reliant on medicine sourced globally, including in India and China. India, ironically, despite being renowned as a key player in the global pharmaceutical industry, has its own reliance on China for the key ingredient stage of drug production, sourcing about 70% of its APIs from China. And the Indian government had various inquiries in the years leading up to the pandemic about the need to overcome this reliance. It makes its announcements about we need to manufacture more APIs locally, and it put in place various schemes for specialized industrial parks where manufacture of APIs could take place, and also identified key active pharmaceutical ingredients for certain drug therapeutic categories that it would provide incentives to facilitate that production taking place in India. And especially in the African context, there has been a major push to increase local production. This map is from the World Medicine Situation in 2004. In green, essentially, is countries that have significant domestic pharmaceutical manufacturing capabilities, and in grey or darkly colored is countries with little to no pharmaceutical manufacturing capabilities. The part of the world that clearly stands out here is Africa, which has very little pharmaceutical manufacturing capabilities. It's estimated that only 1% of the vaccines administered in Africa are actually manufactured there. Now, it wasn't the COVID pandemic which made people realize that there was little pharmaceutical production in Africa. Actually, the African Union has taken initiative since 2005 when it made a declaration to support local pharmaceutical production to try and increase manufacturing of pharmaceuticals on the continent. It issued a pharmaceutical manufacturing plan for Africa in 2007, a business plan to support that in 2012. Various regional economic communities, such as the East African community in particular, have taken a whole series of policy initiatives to try and support local pharmaceutical production for a decade or more now. But it's particularly a push towards local production in vaccines that we're seeing since the pandemic has broken out in the African context. This is a map showing 30 African vaccine manufacturing projects announced across 14 countries. There were a few already established vaccine manufacturers in Africa: the Institut Pasteur in Dakar in Senegal, Biovac in South Africa, but many other countries and many other investments have since been announced. One major problem here is that many countries are trying to do the exact same thing at the exact same time as each other. Much of this initial announcements of expanding vaccine manufacturing was to produce COVID-19 vaccines. About 83% of these announcements were linked to COVID-19 vaccines. Now there's, of course, very little market, or little to no market for those COVID-19 vaccines. So Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance, and the Clinton Health Access Initiative, amongst other international organizations, have called for much greater coordination and strategic approach to increasing vaccine manufacturing in Africa. But this is something that the G7, many international organizations are pushing, that for Africa in particular, global cooperation failed during the pandemic, and there's a feeling that if we can't rely on the global community, we need to do more to manufacture locally. There's, however, a number of challenges that I think the African context points to, but are also relevant elsewhere in actually shifting to more local supply of medicines or vaccines. This is an image of being constrained by a chain. And what I mean here is Global supply chains exist and are very well established and consolidated in recent years. Much of the push towards localization of vaccine production in Africa is very much at the fill-finish stage of vaccine manufacturing, which is the very final stage. The earlier stage for vaccines of drug substance production, which is somewhat similar to the active pharmaceutical ingredient production for medicines, is largely not part of the localization plans. Active pharmaceutical ingredient production doesn't take place so much on the continent, and the push for more medicines production has also been very much at the final stage of the value chain, formulations production, seen as a more easily enterable stage of the production process. But the reality then is that even if you localize the fill-finish part of vaccine production or the formulation part of medicine production, that you are still reliant on either drug substances for vaccines or a whole range of ingredients, and perhaps also manufacturing equipment from abroad. So you're not necessarily self-sufficient even with more localization. And there's a risk or a downside to active pharmaceutical ingredient localization elsewhere. We've seen Sanofi make prominent announcement about creating a new company called Euro API with manufacturing sites including in the UK and elsewhere. But this is a very chemical and essentially environmentally dirty process. Some of the places in India and China where this production takes place are located beside the sea, and after going through a common effluent treatment plant, the waste is discharged through a pipeline out into the ocean. Many people may not want some aspects of a very chemical-intensive process to be located near them, although of course there are advanced techniques that can be used to manage that to some extent. But a lot of the localization in some places is partial. So it doesn't necessarily mean complete self-sufficiency within the value chain. Another key challenge is, will buyers buy? And by this I mean for some aspects of pharmaceuticals, the market is actually quite concentrated in terms of who purchases. So for vaccines in Africa, about 50% or more of those vaccines are purchased by Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance, an international organization backed by the World Health Organization, and also involving a lot of Gates Foundation support. UNICEF coordinates about 90% of the logistics and procurement for vaccines in Africa as well. So some of that in conjunction with Gavi, but also with other organizations. So there's centralized buyers, and so the question is whether these buyers will buy from African manufacturers or will they buy from manufacturers elsewhere? When I've talked to, and this is a similar question for prominent buyers for medicines like the Global Fund for HIV/AIDS, TB, and malaria. When I talk to people running companies manufacturing medicines within Africa, many of them complain that these international organizations just don't buy from them. These international organizations are under pressure for their budget, and their aim is to deliver as much medicines or vaccines for the budget they have available to maximize the health impact. And they've primarily prioritized large concentration of procurement, especially from India, for both medicines and vaccines. Gavi is talking now about needing to recognize the benefits for the world of a more diversified range of manufacturers and suppliers of vaccines and putting in place some mechanisms to support that. The Global Fund has done some limited procurement of medicines from India in recent years. Not from India, from African producers. The vast majority still comes from India. So there is some sense of a shift of buyers being willing to buy from Africa, even if it is in the short term more expensive, although the vast majority of procurement that the buyers go to is still India and China because of the economies of scale and the efficiency benefits that come from that. And there's a real trade-off here in terms of for localization of production, not just in the African context, but also elsewhere, is what happens if local production is more expensive than global sourcing. One prominent example recently, South Africa, which, like many other countries, also recognized and talked about the need to promote more domestic manufacturing capacity. Early in 2023, it announced that one of its tenders for one of its vaccines would be allocated to procurement from Cipla, an Indian company. This attracted a lot of uproar in the South African media because BioVac, a South African company, actually had the capacity to produce that vaccine and had bidded to supply that tender. However, the South African Health Ministry justified the decision to award the tender to the Indian company, partly around the various rules around procurement which they have, including that local companies need to be within a certain percentage of the cost of imported vaccines in order, you can be a little bit more expensive, but you can't be too much more expensive. And secondly, they said, well, look, with the money we save by importing this vaccine from India, there's 2 other new vaccines which we can introduce for children in South Africa that we wouldn't be able to do if we bought the first vaccine from the domestic company. So there's an opportunity cost that can be here. This varies depending on the country and context in terms of the longer term goal of supporting local manufacturing versus the kind of short term challenge of needing to meet health needs now. And it's one thing in a global health emergency to say we need to support and supply and manufacture more domestically, but it's another thing when you're facing budgetary constraints in not an immediate emergency, but dealing with the various ongoing chronic issues which health ministries around the world face. It's another thing to then actually, are you going to face a financial penalty, and how much financial penalty are you willing to pay in order to promote the goal of local manufacturing, which may or may not, depending on the situation, over X number of years, which is an uncertain amount of time, become competitive with global sourcing. So in the pharmaceutical context, I think what we're seeing is in many sense not a deglobalization, but more of a reglobalization, where we're not seeing an eradication of the globalized model of the pharmaceutical industry. At the same time, we're not seeing a kind of complete back to pre-pandemic ways of doing things. There is talk of greater local manufacturing in many parts of the world that has been backed up to some extent by investments, by incentives from governments to support more domestic manufacturing capacity. But for the most part, there is quite an ingrained pattern of globalized supply, which does look like it's continuing to some extent. That said, there are continued policy efforts to diversify production, especially into places like the African context, which have had very little aspects of vaccine or drug production. The African Union wants to have, by 2040, it set itself a goal of 60% of the vaccines being administered in Africa being manufactured in Africa, from 1% now. To me, that will be a very spectacular achievement if it is made. But what may be more likely is to see some smaller level of percentage. And this is a space we need to watch how it plays out in other countries in terms of the extent that production shifts back to being more local. And I think more broadly, pharmaceuticals is perhaps to some extent representative of the wider ongoing adjustments to globalization. That for all the talk of end of globalization across different industries, whether it's the controversies over in electronics industry over chips, that we are seeing some move away from reliance on China, but not a complete move away from globalized supply. It still might be some production elsewhere in East Asia. So my suggestion is that the future of pharmaceuticals in a fracturing world is some more diversified supply chains, but not a complete shift towards more local production. And I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Let's get underway. Harry's got the microphone. So if you want to use the mic, he's downstairs, and Dave, I think, is upstairs. Thank you, Dave. He's got the microphone there. So if upstairs wants the microphone, please wave a hand and keep drawing attention to yourselves. Right, quality. There's some questions here about quality that are coming up, Rory. So, Guy Benson, are there significant differences in quality control between countries? Sean King, how may patients be assured of the quality of their medications in the context of the many small manufacturers who are thousands of miles away? How, as he puts it, how do we know that the penicillin is really just that? Cynthia England, if a large proportion of our pharmaceuticals are imported from India and China, ought we to have confidence in those purchased by the NHS when so many can be purchased on the internet by individuals and that have dubious validity? You might want to talk a bit separately about the internet question, but let's talk about quality in the round.
So are there differences in quality between countries? Yes. The two broadest distinction is between countries which have what's referred to as a stringent regulatory authority and then on the other side, non-stringent regulatory authority. Stringent regulatory authorities being, for example, the UK MHRA, the Food and Drug Authority in the United States, and in the European Union. Many low and middle income countries do have drug regulatory authorities, although that's largely a 21st century phenomenon. Many of them are not well resourced in terms of number of staffing and ability to go and inspect factories. I guess the good news in terms of medicines that are exported from India to the UK or to the United States is that those medicines are not just regulated by an Indian body, the Central Drugs Standard Control Organization, but they would have to meet the regulatory approvals and inspection of the UK regulator or the US regulator. So, for example, the most US FDA approved sites in the world outside America is in India. And these are facilities which are inspected by regulators from the US FDA. So it is up to as good as the degree and stringency and reliability of the procedures that the US FDA or the UK MHRA put in place is how reliable the medicines are. And they should be doing the same for a factory, whether it's thousands of miles away or whether it's within this country. There's question marks that came up in a very prominent book about the truth about the generic drug industry, about whether the US FDA really was doing the same thing in India and elsewhere. Some of the challenges that they faced was that they would, first of all, before they had people permanently based in India, they would have to get a visa for India. Then they would send, in a sense, there would be quite a considerable amount of advance notice for a local company in India that the inspectors were coming. From America, people would find out they'd arrived in the city or town in the hotel and were coming the next day. There were various journalistic reports. This is a book by Catherine Eban that various things would happen in the factory's emergency preparations the night before the inspectors to get ready for the inspection. The US FDA has responded and said, well, now we have a large team based permanently in India, and that most of the drugs do meet the same standards. So there are differences across the world, but what should matter is what country it's consumed in, and that all drugs consumed in the UK should be of the same quality.
I'd like to get you to talk about some of the various actors or stakeholders or investors in these industries. Firstly, Joe Sexton wondered if you could explain more fully about UNICEF and Gavi, the sort of the part they play, the funding, the constraints, who controls them, and the pressures on them in playing a part in helping to save lives.
I mean, international organizations are particularly crucial, such as UNICEF and Gavi, especially in low-income countries, so primarily in Africa, to some extent in some lower middle-income countries as well. This is primarily where governments don't necessarily have sufficient resources themselves in terms of their health budgets to buy these drugs or vaccines. So what Gavi does is it partly plays a role in the procurement, and UNICEF plays a big role in the logistics. They have been part of setting up a whole regulatory system for drugs and vaccines to be supplied, especially to African countries. The World Health Organization pre-qualification system, which is a much higher standard than that domestically in many of the producing countries. Gavi also is involved in supporting the development of potential drugs and vaccines. So I don't know how many of you have seen this week the first routine anti-malarial vaccination started in Cameroon. This vaccine was developed by GSK, a British company, but Gavi had some role, I believe, in the funding of the research behind it, and is now also involved in fostering technology transfer agreement for the scaling up of not the GSK one, but there's another anti-malarial vaccine by Oxford University who's partnering with Serum Institute of India. And basically what's happening here is the same model has happened with the COVID-19 vaccine. Oxford developed the vaccine. AstraZeneca didn't have the same manufacturing capacity and couldn't reach the same population as India could. So the aim is that with Serum Institute of India being involved in this anti-malarial vaccine, the manufacturing of it, that they could actually reach maybe 100 million doses by the end of 2025. That's if the Oxford Serum Institute anti-malarial vaccine takes off. So Gavi's playing roles in multiple stages of not just the procurement and distribution, but also in the ecosystem around the development of vaccines too. They're also involved in discussions around pandemic preparedness too.
Let's talk a bit about other investors or potential investors. Esme's wondering whether to localize vaccine and medicine production, and you showed us the map where all those countries in Africa with no capabilities at all, it would seem. So she's wondering whether to actually achieve that localization of production, does it actually require international actors to bring it about? And if so, how would that come about?
There are a lot of international actors already involved in this whole African vaccine manufacturing issue and debate. G7 countries have been supporting it. The African Union has helped facilitate. There's something called a Partnership for African Vaccine Manufacturing Initiative. Gavi's involved in the discussions, the CEPI, the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness and Innovation. So there's a lot of international organizations involved. There are, at the same time, a lot of still uncoordinated announcements that have been made. And I think the biggest message that has come out from Gavi and Clinton Health Access is the need for greater coordination on this. So this really hits back at part of my key message that localization of production is not a substitute for international cooperation. So in a way, localization has been presented as the solution because global cooperation failed, and it especially failed Africa. We need to do localization. But localization, to be successful, needs coordination. It doesn't make sense if all African countries do the same thing at the same time, because they'll only end up having then a market for within their own country, and it could be incredibly expensive. So I think coordination is needed, and at multiple levels internationally, but especially within the African continent.
Various industries in which there are accusations of subsidies being made. It comes up from time to time, for example, in the steel industry around Europe. So Bob Winter's wondering whether you're aware of any subsidies, for instance, by the Indians and the Chinese to add to the success of the large industries they've established. Are they lowballing? Are they undermining the efforts to create capacity elsewhere?
So when I interview people running pharmaceutical companies in India and I ask them, what benefits do you get from the government to support your activities? They say, none at all. The government does nothing for us. They don't help us at all, which is perhaps not a very surprising answer. When I go and interview people in African countries and ask them about the nature of competition they face from India, they're, over in India they're getting all these subsidies for this and this and this. So in one way you could say, well, my method of finding out about this through interviews is not a very good methodology to actually find out the reality. India government does have some mechanisms. It has meetings to help connect manufacturers with markets elsewhere. But I think what they've really done most of all is and there's incentives for limited taxes, for example, in what are referred to as more backward zones, especially some of the states in northern India like Himachal Pradesh for formulations production. What I think they've done most of all is have a kind of a conducive policy system to support the industry more broadly, first from not having much patent protection for a long time, but more broadly recently to help support some extent research and development, to help support exports, for example, and in general having a very benefiting from economies of scale. So there is a supportive environment that Indian and Chinese companies benefit from, but not to my knowledge massive scale of subsidies. There's just so many companies within India that the actual level of competition kind of has that effect of kind of pushing the whole industry forward to some extent.
Gordon Pearson is a bit I don't know what to say. He's an economist, and he's got a bit of a jaundiced view and he says, well, Big Pharma, by reputation, is just a group of monopoly exploiters. So he wonders how far political government around the world is sort of dominated by these monopolies. Do you want to comment on that? I mean, do you think they are sufficiently controlled? Do you think that they are taking advantage of any situations?
So how far which is controlled? The governments around the world?
No, these are he regards the big pharmaceutical companies as the monopolists, taking advantage of that, and he wonders how far. I think he wonders how far they are sort of penetrate the government systems in order to sustain their monopolies.
I mean, I think the monopoly of big pharma is actually, it's present in some areas. These companies still lead innovation and the development of new drugs. China and India have really struggled to make breakthroughs in finding new drugs and new cures and developing new vaccines. So for certain areas, there's a clear monopoly of big pharma. But if we were to compare the situation to, let's say, the 1960s when India was trying to develop its domestic pharmaceutical industry, at that time, the price of drugs in India was amongst the highest in the world. And there was basically drugs imported by big pharma at a very high price or no alternative. So India starts to develop a domestic industry. Now, precisely because of the rise of India and China, there is a serious alternative to big pharma for generic drugs. So even if big pharma didn't really make much progress in supplying antiretrovirals within Africa, well, that issue could actually be made, substantial progress emerged in that issue outside of big pharma through Indian connections with Africa. So there's areas where we do see that the monopoly of big pharma is not the same as it was before, but there are other areas where I think there is still considerable, it's still big pharma that are very much the kind of key players.
If we could just turn to the here and now in the UK, and these are the perceptions of the members in front of you. So 3 of them are asking the same sort of question. So Cheryl Butler, what's the real reason for shortages of certain drugs such as HRT, diabetes, cancer and so on? Judith Provis, what in your opinion are the reasons for the current shortages of medicines in the UK? And we've got Janet. Any comments about the supply chain in the UK and it causing distress to patients and additional work for the NHS? And so, do you recognise those a shortage situation in the UK? And would you like to explore the various reasons why it might exist?
I mean, I think the number of drugs recognized as under shortage, there is evidence that that has increased in the last few years. There are more broadly disruptions to global supply chains which have emerged and become more common and more frequent. There was the Suez Canal got blocked a few years ago, the Ukraine-Russia situation, the general increasing trade protectionism has meant that, in a sense, global supply chains aren't as reliable as they used to be or aren't as predictable. I think the key question is whether there's something to do with either pharmaceuticals as an industry or the UK as a country, which make that more common in this country, in this industry. And one of the reasons that seems to be pointed to, perhaps more broadly for the UK, that could be a factor is Brexit, which of course has changed the trading relationship with Europe, but more specifically to pharmaceuticals, is that as part of the NHS's commitment to kind of getting value for money with its procurement, there are limits on how much it can pay for certain drugs, and that may have inadvertently disincentivized certain suppliers to supply to this country. So it's not something I have huge expertise on, but that seems to be the message that I pick up on in the media on that.
Since we mentioned Brexit, Ian Watson's asking the question of whether Brexit has harmed the prospect of our 2 world-class pharmaceutical companies, AstraZeneca and GSK, in getting approvals for their new medicines. Has this become more fragmented? Is there any clear pattern?
I mean, probably in the case of the COVID-19, excuse me, the COVID-19 vaccine, in the case of Oxford AstraZeneca, it was probably an advantage that in that situation, that being outside the European Union, because the UK government went on its own procurement initiative separate from the European Union, it provided support to Oxford and AstraZeneca for the scaling up, and it bought priority access. So there was perhaps kind of greater autonomy that the UK government had there. It's difficult to tell whether there's broader regulatory challenges in getting approvals. I would not expect there to be too many, given both the UK and is still largely in kind of at a similar level to European Union in terms of regulation, but also still very much part, for the most part, of European processes for approval of drugs. So I wouldn't expect there to be, in that particular aspect, too many difficulties.
Okay, we're going to take a question on the left.
To some extent, my question follows on from what you're just saying. Where are the brains that produce the original first-time drugs? Are they university-based, which I understood Oxford and Cambridge were? Are they the brains that exist within the research laboratories of individual drug companies? You mentioned the anti-malarial one in the States, which I can see that would have been developed in-house. But where are the brains that produce the brand new drugs in the first place?
I mean, in terms of where in the world are they, they're very much in Europe, more broadly, including the UK and in the United States. In terms of, and as I said before, China and India have really struggled to break through into new innovation. They're amazing at imitation, but innovation has been a struggle. In terms of entities, this, it ranges from, I mean, this, let's say that take this anti-malarial vaccine, that's GSK, I believe, has been the main developer of that. We take the mRNA vaccine, which was a kind of new technology that got particular attention during the pandemic. I believe that was originally some university research done in both in America and in Germany, and that in a sense, I mean, didn't get a lot of recognition within the university, but then ended up having a huge commercialization. This is Pfizer-BioNTech, that vaccine. So there, in a sense, I'm not sure you could say there's one particular type of player. There's different routes. In general, big pharma, the overall landscape is that big pharma and the rate of innovation is slowing down. In the pharmaceutical industry, there's less new drugs being discovered and found now than there were a few decades ago. There is a switch, of course, to biotech-based drugs. The biotech industry tends to have smaller companies which do original research, but then when there's a need to kind of scale up and commercialize and go through more expensive later stage trials, often partnerships with bigger companies come in. So I think there's multiple actors involved.
To what extent can you quantify the position of the UK industry? Because two of our members are asking about that. David Roots, to what extent has the UK capacity for manufacturing pharmaceuticals changed as a result of COVID? And Terry O'Neill, to what extent has the UK followed through with the expressed need, I presume from government, to develop a domestic capability within the UK or even the EU? So do we, I suppose is this a question about, do we have a UK strategy for pharmaceuticals?
I mean, yeah, I think quantity I'll struggle to address, but qualitatively, there's clearly a greater prominence and recognition of the strategic importance of domestic manufacturing capacity for pharmaceuticals and vaccines. I think the UK government has been astute in recognizing that it can't do this alone, and it has been quite proactive in nurturing the relationship with India more broadly, and including the Serum Institute of India, but more broadly having a pharma and biotech strategy which does relate to engagement of India with India. I think that's especially important for the positioning of India, the UK, in the world, and its ability to be competitive, because there's different strengths that the UK and India have. And as I find in much of my African pharmaceutical research, I find if you can't beat India or China, or somebody said to me this in an interview in South Africa, if you can't beat them, join them. And I think there's key benefits to partnering with India and China to that extent. The UK government has made pretty big investments during the pandemic, of course, in supporting Oxford University and supporting AstraZeneca. So it depends what your expectations are as well. if it's the expectation from the talk of things being done locally, not being reliant on anything from abroad, if you expect there to be zero foreign reliance, you're going to be disappointed. But if you're expecting something of a more incremental growth and some support for UK manufacturing vis-a-vis the case before the pandemic, I think that's probably more realistic.
If anyone upstairs would like to use the microphone, just wave towards David near the back doors. Meanwhile, we've got a question on the front row.
Dr. Horner, my question follows partly from the additional microphone question about brains and development, and you touched on things being generic and non-generic a little bit tonight. During the COVID pandemic in particular, and you mentioned about South Africa and HIV, there's talk of the costs of these medicines, and obviously that's down to the intellectual property, and there are arguments about releasing the patents for cheaper development. But of course, then the counter-argument is no one's going to develop anything they can't profit from. So where does the balance currently lie, and where should it lie, in your opinion?
Yeah, thank you. It's a very important issue. So I think there's a big distinction between patents and what will happen if you remove patent protection for medicines versus for vaccines. And in short, if you remove patent protection for medicines, for chemistry-based drugs, they can be quite easily copied, reverse engineered, and imitated without cooperation of the original company which developed the drug. People in these companies I've talked to say they basically just take the medicine, they take it into their lab, and they break down what the composition of it is, and they can then replicate that. The difference with vaccines is that you have active agents, and you basically need cooperation from the innovator to be sure that you are replicating the exact same vaccine in order to scale it up. So a lot of the activist groups campaigning about more access to COVID-19 vaccines put a lot of emphasis on patents, but to me they were playing the same activist game around medicines, which was patents are the barrier, removing patent protection will solve the access issue. But if you remove patent protection in vaccines, you're not going to have a company producing the same vaccine without the cooperation of the company which originally developed the drug. So patents are not, to me, the same barrier for access to vaccines as they are to pharmaceuticals. And there was you basically need technology transfer and cooperation of the innovator. So there's a different role that it's playing there. For medicines, it's still now a small number of drugs where patents are the barrier or issue, because the vast majority of drugs are off patent. Of course, those drugs which are under patent, it can be a key barrier to access. The final part is, are patents needed as an incentive for innovation? There's a lot of debate around this in terms of whether for scientists it actually really motivates them is the patent, but I think quite a lot of questioning of whether patents really kind of provide the fire, I think it was the spark or the fire for that innovative step. So yeah, really important I think to make the distinction between medicines and vaccines, and patents were hugely the barrier for HIV/AIDS medicines, but not the same way for COVID vaccines, and not going to be for other vaccines that I can see in the same way.
Could you talk a little bit about R&D? There are a number of questions here which are trying to understand from your talk what the impact is in that area. We've got a very good picture about the production systems and the balance of power. So, Sue Wright, how important is the globalization of the development of new drugs compared with production? Graham Daly, he's wondering what effect, if any, the patent reduction in India has had on pure research expenditure. Sue Taylor, will funding for development of new medicines come primarily from private industry or governments? Can you build us a picture of the future of R&D?
So I think there has been a globalization of aspects of research and development. So clinical trials for medicines and vaccines have very much been globalized, where populations in Africa, India, etc., are part of the trials for development of new drugs and new vaccines. There's contract research agreements with companies in India and China. For the most part, Indian and Chinese companies have not struggled they've really struggled themselves to take a new drug to market. Indian companies were investing a lot in R&D 15 years ago. Their annual report said, our mission is to become the first kind of R&D intensive Indian company to bring a new drug to the world market. That discourse has toned down considerably, and this sort of division of labor to me that's emerged is the original research is very much still in the kind of traditional places of Europe and America where new drugs are likely to be developed, but parts of the research process, what we wouldn't call new product development, but improved processes. So improved processes and more efficient production processes can come from India and China, and so doing process efficiencies can come there, but new products are very much still centered in Europe and North America. India does have stronger patent protection now, so that changed from 1995 when India joined the World Trade Organization. There was 10 years to adjust, and that was part of then, and as a consequence of that, Indian companies did get a lot more involved in doing their own R&D, but having patent protection in place wasn't, of course, sufficient for Indian companies to start developing new drugs. They faced barriers in lack of expertise and lack of people with experience in R&D. They hired many non-resident Indians who had experience abroad in R&D for major companies, but they've still struggled for the most part to make that breakthrough. In terms of private companies or governments, I think COVID-19 definitely was one example where public funding played a major role in supporting private companies to develop, and also universities, of course, in the Oxford case, to develop and their vaccine to a stage where it was ready to go through clinical trials and also to support the trials. And many studies do show that a lot of drugs on the market can be originally traced back to some extent to public R&D. And this is where the arguments for limiting the extent of patent protection, for maybe providing alternative incentives to private companies come from, that actually public money can underlie many of the drugs that are currently popular in the market, even if private companies may have a relative monopoly on them today.
Can you comment on whether there's any of this research being done in the country, the lower income countries, Africa and so on? Because Clive Ashton is suggesting here that East Africa is heavily involved in research. He put research in block letters. Research funded by who? And organized by pharmaceutical organizations, for example, in malaria research. Is that anything you know about? And are you aware of useful research being done on the ground in countries beyond, in some of these countries that need the help most?
Yeah, I mean,
in Africa.
Obviously, it makes sense that it's very hard to do all of the processes to develop an anti-malarial drug, or now an anti-malarial vaccine in a country with very little malaria. So it does make sense, of course, to have key involvement of populations that are exposed to malaria, but it's not an autonomous process that can be done in Kenya without international collaboration and support, at least as far as I'm aware. I'm sorry, maybe the questioner may know more about this specific example than me, but it does make sense to have local involvement in that, but I don't think that means that this is an example of completely sort of lower middle income country-led innovation. I still suspect that that's largely a kind of international slash high income country initiative.
Okay. I've got about 4 questions, then we in our conclusion. You probably touched on this, but John Mottram, we talked about quality. John Mottram is just saying, how big is the issue of counterfeit medicines? He says, especially in Africa. Is that the language you use, counterfeit medicines, and is it sort of seen as a problem? Is it measured, monitored?
Counterfeit medicines, sometimes it's a term used more broadly, so there's different types. So counterfeit, so there's also substandard drugs. So substandard drugs are those which claim to be doing something, but they basically don't do it to the same extent as they should. So they might have less ingredient than they should, so they'll sort of do what they're meant to do, but only to a limited extent. So the company may have kind of put the ingredient in there, but not as much as is meant to. Or they may not have had as good stabilization aspects involved in the drug. So basically the drug might be good for a month, but if it was consumed after 3 months, it may not be as effective as it was meant to. Counterfeit is where, to my understanding, a drug is kind of presented as something, but it's not that at all. So in some cases, there's been protests from the generic drug industry that all of generic drugs are being claimed as counterfeit by big pharma. And so there's, but I think in terms of the broader population problem of are drugs all in an African context what they're meant to be, there are definite shortcomings. And that's partly that the quality control in place is not strong. Local governments do not have capabilities to have full control over what enters their borders and to inspect it in terms of drugs. That doesn't mean that all of the drugs in those countries are potentially dodgy. There's actually some of those drugs are coming through Global Fund for HIV, AIDS, TB, malaria, are coming through UNICEF, are coming through Gavi regulated processes. So it should be good quality and very reliable. Others, the Ministry of Health may have bought them, and it depends on the Ministry of Health processes. It's those in the private market in many African countries which I'd be most worried about, where there's a lot of scope for variation, and for the most part, not a uniform, strict process in place. So I think that's where the particular area of improvement is needed, especially in terms of regulation.
Quick comment on to answer Paul Scott's question about the current UK-India trade talks. I've lost track of how long they've been going on, but he wonders whether the UK whether pharmaceuticals plays a part in those discussions, whether the UK is proposing any changes to the terms for generic drugs and so on. Is pharmaceuticals an important part of that dialogue that we have with that country?
The European Union has been in free trade agreement talks with India since at least the mid-2000s, and since the UK now has policy autonomy on it, it's subsequently had its own discussions with India. The issue that comes up the most in these discussions is whether the UK is pushing for greater patent protection in place in this agreement that could restrict entry of generic medicines to the UK. It has been quite a common aspect of trade agreements and discussions since the WTO was formed, that the WTO kind of provides quite a high level actually of patent protection for all countries that are part of the WTO, but countries with particular interests in protecting the position and monopolistic position of companies which have a lot of patents, those countries have tried to go beyond the WTO level of patenting to a higher level of patent protection. And that's the concern that Médecins Sans Frontières and other groups, Global Justice Now, have been raising that they're concerned that the UK may increase the level of patent protection involved. That would only affect certain drugs that are under patent protection now. It shouldn't affect the vast majority of already available generic drugs.
Two to go. First one is environment, climate, and Julie's wondering whether the manufacturers are making efforts on environmental impact, for example, on their packaging, blister packs, and so on, while Don Muir wonders whether there is significant discharge of waste into the ocean when these things are being produced, and whether there's enough research into the effects, ecological effects of them doing so. How big an issue do you think it is and should be?
So in terms of there being a lot of environmental discussions around the packaging, this doesn't appear to me as a prominent topic of debate within the pharmaceutical industry. Many of my colleagues in our global value chain research group at the University of Manchester work on textile industry, work on agricultural industry supply chains, electronics even, where there are much palm oil. There's much more prominent discussions around the environmental aspect and putting in place environmental standards. I think mainly because the health aspect is so significant first, that the relationship with public health is, of course, the most obvious and prominent issue. There are some limited kind of sustainability initiatives to my mind, but I don't think this issue is anywhere near as prominent and seeing as much momentum in pharmaceuticals compared to other industries. In relation to the second part about discharge of waste into ocean, this is a huge issue, especially in the Indian context. So the area where active pharmaceutical ingredient production in India, that chemical part of the production process where it started, was largely around Hyderabad. Hyderabad had a company called Indian Drugs and Pharmaceuticals Limited, which was set up there as a state-owned company in the early 1960s. Some scientists, and then some of the key people who then led Indian private companies got experience there and then developed their own companies. The most prominent example being Dr. Angie Reddy, who had a PhD in chemistry, worked for IDPL, and ended up setting up a company called Dr. Reddy's Laboratories, which is one of the top 3 Indian pharmaceutical companies. Now, in the greater Hyderabad area, they've had a ban on expanding active pharmaceutical ingredient production since the late 1980s. In the mid-2000s, some Swedish researchers did testing on some of the waters in the local rivers in that area and basically found that consuming water in the broader area where some of this production had taken place and still did take place was equivalent to taking an unknown cocktail of leftovers from different drugs. So there has been a lot of movement to try and restrict the expansion of that part of the industry there, to put in place greater regulation on API industry. So this is a real challenge for trying to, on the one side, promote this part of the industry to have greater strategic autonomy, but at the same time dealing with the environmental consequences. The main solution has been to concentrate that production in specialized industrial parks. There's one called Pharma City, which is in Vizag on the east coast of India, which I visited, and its key developer is Ramki, a waste management company, which tells you the key developer of the industrial park is a waste management company. The key bit of common infrastructure that's being provided to companies that locate there is the kind of ability to deal and manage waste. So there's still some waste, but it's meant to go through certain processes and procedures. And I think that's part of, it is linked more broadly to the globalization of sourcing of active pharmaceutical ingredients, that there have been less stringent environmental regulations in China as well as India, and this aspect of the industry is especially concentrated in China. So it's a key part and issue to think about in terms of the future of that part of production.
Could you end by answering Linda and Jill's question? It's been reported that when the next pandemic arises, we'll be in a worse position than we were before COVID. Would you agree, and do you think anything has been learnt from the last few years? And as Jill puts it, how do we need to prepare for the next pandemic?
So are we in a worse position? I think the feeling of dissatisfaction with pandemic preparedness would come to me from the feeling that we should be in a better position than we are. That given how uncoordinated much of what happened was, how much inequalities were present, both domestically but especially internationally, that there should be more progress in pandemic preparedness than there is. I don't think we're in a worse position though, and I think one of the key aspects where I would prefer, call it that, to see more progress is in international cooperation and coordination. Part of my message is that I don't think localization is an alternative to cooperation, and localization needs to go along with cooperation. So CEPI has something called the 100 Days Mission. CEPI, like Gavi and like UNICEF, is another international organization involved in this landscape. It was founded in 2017. And it's trying to, as part of this 100 Days Mission, diversify the range of vaccine manufacturers in the world, and so that in the case of a new pandemic, it will only take 100 days from the onset of the pandemic to the availability and initiation of routine immunization against that pandemic. And if you think back to what happened with COVID-19, early January there starts to be news of this happening in China. 100 days from then is roughly mid-April. So before the virus got too widespread elsewhere in the world. So if you can limit to 100 days, you can actually really make significant progress in curbing the potential geographic spread of a future pandemic. CEPI is making various investments, agreements with companies, including Serum Institute of India, to kind of finance them outside the immediate emergency so that they're ready for the emergency. Because the key challenge is the money suddenly appears when there's an emergency, but who's going to pay for these manufacturers to kind of have the facilities available, and what are they going to do with those facilities when it's not an emergency? So CEPI is working on this, but I think there could be more emphasis and resources on that, and at the same stage, much greater coordination of how this localization movement is taking place in order to be better prepared for the next pandemic.
Rory, thank you for answering so many questions. Apologies to anyone whose questions were not put, but I hope you feel you had a very rich and deep exploration of this quite interesting subject. And thank you for the talk you gave at the beginning with your slide presentation, which illuminated what for us is probably quite a complicated and technical subject. I'm sure we're all going to leave here feeling much more well-informed, and perhaps I hope you're all feeling a little bit better. So as a result of listening to Rory, and let's take a positive message from his talk with us tonight. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.
Rory Horner. Yeah.